Maria Margaronis is a London-based correspondent for The Guardian. For The Nation, yes. First of all, sorry, and a contributor to The Guardian and the BBC.
Hello. First, thank you very much to AnalyzeGreece for inviting me. I feel slightly here on false pretenses because, unlike my colleagues here, I'm not a daily newspaper reporter. I'm not based in Greece. I come and go. I am Greek. I live in London. And so I don't face those kinds of daily pressures. I don't write daily news stories. And that's a great luxury because it means that I can do a kind of what I think of almost as anthropological reporting, descriptive reporting, analytical reporting, which is a very different kind of work. It means I can spend weeks reporting a story if I want to, or making a radio documentary. But I have been watching what's been happening quite a lot. When I began writing a lot about Greece more than 10 years ago, I thought of myself as being involved in an act of translation, which in a way I still do, which is trying to explain Greece as much as I could to English-speaking readers in America and in Britain, truthfully, but with sympathy. And it was a much tougher project then. I remember trying to write about the Kosovo War, about why it was that in Britain all we saw on TV was Albanians fleeing their homes in Kosovo, and in Greece all we saw on TV was the bombing of Belgrade, and trying to explain with some history and politics why that should be the case. There's a lot of complaining that goes on about reporting about Greece, but there's a lot of really excellent reporting that's been happening too in the last 5 years, and I think the barriers have broken down, and despite the stereotypes, despite the crisis, despite the situation, I think there's actually a lot more understanding of Greece outside than there was before the crisis. That, I think, would not be possible without the work of some really brilliant young Greek journalists who work as fixers for foreign media here, who never get recognised, and who work invisibly, mostly. It's also helped a lot by some of the new English language websites that have been produced in Greece, and I think of Acropolis, founded by Nick Makoutsis, the Press Project, Keep Talking Greece, and of course now AnalyzeGreece and others. At the same time, there's a lot of shorthand that gets recycled in what the veteran Dutch correspondent Ingeborg Beugel called the journalistic echo chamber. And that's partly a function of the pressure that my colleagues have talked about. For instance, in today's Guardian, I read in a piece by an economics correspondent, shut out of international markets, Athens has conceded that it will miss the fixed June payment without new loans from the EU, which is demanding reforms that will make the country's debt sustainable. Make the country's debt sustainable? If only, if only. So a lot of the time, because of the fact that most international reporting is based on the things that are of interest to the financial markets, international readers, things that will hit either people's pockets or people's politics outside Greece, I don't recognise the country that I come back to from time to time from what I've been reading in the foreign press. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to give you a little sort of history of the stereotypes that have been around in Greece, or about Greece rather, over the last few years. Without proposing some sort of narcissistic, they will hate us account of Miss Hellenism. I do think that some of the stuff we hear about the lazy Greeks, the tax evading Greeks, as you put it, the not quite European Greeks, the not really white Greeks, it's been around for a very long time. And nobody's yet written the Greek version that would say it's Orientalism or Maria Margaronis was imagining the Balkans, but the book is long overdue. So forgive me if this is familiar to you, but I think the stereotype of the cunning, shifty and untrustworthy Greeks begins with the Roman poet Juvenal, who wrote in one of his satires about the Greek who will do whatever you ask him to do. He'll be a geometer, painter, masseur, tightrope walker, doctor, magician. He says, the hungry Greekling knows it all, omnia novit Graecus essuriens. And then jumping forward all the way to the 18th and 19th century, we have a sort of splitting of Greek identity in the mind of Europe between the Aryan ancients who belonged to Western Europe and the fallen, Slavicized modern Greeks who belonged to the backward Orient. And the best known exponent of this view was the Tyrolean traveller Jakob Falmermeier, who said that history has been the result of the struggle between two basic elements, split apart by a divine power from the very beginning, a flexible life process on the one side, and a formless, undeveloped stasis on the other. The symbol of the former is eternal Rome, and of the latter is Constantinople with the ossified Orient. You might think this is all ancient history, But if you compare Maria with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, published in 1993, which was an attempt to provide a framework for the projection of American power after the Cold War, we get something very similar. Greece is not part of Western civilization, but it was the home of classical civilization. It was an important source of Western civilization. Greece is an anomaly, the orthodox outsider in Western organizations. It has never been an easy member of either the EU or NATO, and has had difficulty adapting itself to the principles and mores of both. Its leaders often seem to go out of their way to deviate from Western norms and to antagonize Western governments. It was poorer than other community and NATO members and often pursued economic policies that seemed to flout the standards prevailing in Brussels. So, you know, like all stereotypes, there's a grain of truth to this. Greece is on the border between East and West, and this has greatly affected its formation and its history. But what stayed in the mind of Western Europe out of all this, I think, is a sense that the Greeks are not quite one of us. And you know, that came out very clearly in the memo that the former US Economic Secretary Tim Geithner wrote about, Treasury Secretary, sorry, Tim Geithner produced after the G7 meeting in 2009, when he said, Europeans came into that meeting basically saying, we're going to teach the Greeks a lesson, they're really terrible, they lied to us, they suck, and they were profligate, and took advantage of the whole basic thing, and we're going to crush them. That was their basic attitude, all of them. Which is not to say that the crisis is not, as Adair said, jointly produced by things that happened in Greece and things that happened outside. What matters is the political uses to which these stereotypes have been put. First, to make Greece appear to be the scapegoat for a global financial crisis, of which it was the first European victim, and so avoid, for a long time, facing the weaknesses of both the global financial system and the Eurozone. Second, to describe and analyze its difficulties not as products of its history, but as the moral failing of the Greek people. And third, to use that view as a means to continue imposing austerity policies, not just in Greece, but in Europe, and to avoid changing course, to avoid facing the fundamental problems of the Eurozone. So what's the role of the media in all of this? And why don't the really good stories that are published about Greece that do help people understand outside what people are living here, why don't they make a difference to policy? Last night I was in Limni in Evia, where I'm on holiday with my family this week, and I was talking to a lady there who said, until ordinary people and not governments understand that Greeks are practically dying in the streets, nothing will change. And then she thought again and she said, on the other hand, we know what's going on, for instance, in Syria, and we think it's nothing to do with us. And I think that we journalists sometimes have an overinflated view of our power and our importance. And we think that things we write can change the world, or much more than they can. Journalists have to write the stories their editors want them to write, which are the stories that are of interest and importance to their readers. People also tell the stories that fit their political framework. In Britain, for instance, we have a very interesting double narrative going on about Greece, because we have sympathy for Greece from left newspapers like The Guardian, but we also have sympathy for Greece from conservative Eurosceptics, like, for instance, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, who writes for the right-wing Daily Telegraph. For both of these outlets, the story of what's happened in Greece is a cautionary tale about the Eurozone, but from different political angles. The other thing is that stories that get published are almost overwhelmingly negative, because suffering, drama, crisis sell much more than positive stories. So there's far less interest in stories about the positive things that are going on here. The small startups, the fact that now you find a lot more Greek products in shops than there used to be even 2 years ago. The solidarity structures, the beginnings of a crackdown on some tax evasion, government's efforts to work on asylum, prison reform, civil rights, citizenship. And that absence perpetuates the image of Greeks as victims, as receivers of handouts, or as struggling heroes, if you're on the left, not as creators or agents of our fate. And then finally, I'd like to really ask my colleagues about something else that has been going on lately, which I don't, as a non-daily newspaper reporter, understand. In the first years of the crisis, some of us felt that we had to report things outside Greece so that they would get reported in Greece, because they weren't being reported here. And I'm thinking about things like corruption, police brutality, Golden Dawn, the migrant crisis. They were not being reported by the Greek media, but if you wrote something about them outside, it would get picked up and reported again here anonymously, and it was a way of circling stories back into Greece. But lately what's been going on is this leak and counter-leak around the negotiations, so that Eurozone officials will leak something to the FT, and Syriza officials will leak something to Channel 4, and you get this endless sort of flurry of pieces full of blind quotes, unattributed quotes, where you have a sense, if you're kind of an outsider to this, as I am, that different people are pushing different agendas, but it's very difficult to understand what's actually going on. So I'd like to ask my colleagues about that, and I'd also like to put out the question of how can we do better.